In the cockpit of Batik Air Flight 6231, Captain Ricosetta Mafella was preparing for departure from Palu Airport. The passengers were strapped in, the sky was clear, and every instrument showed normal readings. It looked like just another routine evening flight across Indonesia. But in the middle of this calm, the captain heard something no one else could. A whisper in his head. A persistent, anxious voice repeating a single command: leave immediately. Against all his training, against the schedule, and against logic, he listened. Minutes later, that irrational decision would save 148 lives. But what was it? Instinct or something beyond explanation? Captain Mafella was known as a disciplined pilot. He respected the rules, checked every detail, and trusted the structure of aviation procedures. But on that September evening in Palu, the sense of order that usually guided his work was disturbed. He sat in the pilot's seat feeling an inexplicable unease. It wasn't the weather, the visibility was perfect. It wasn't the aircraft, all systems were green. It was an internal pressure pressing on his conscience. He looked at his watch, listened to the hum of the engines, and realized he simply could not wait any longer. Turning to his crew, he gave a surprising order. Request clearance for takeoff immediately, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. His co-pilot was confused. In aviation, 3 minutes is an eternity, and early departures are rare. But seeing the captain's confidence, he supported the choice. When Mafella radioed the tower, the young controller on duty, Anthonius Gunawan Agung, heard the urgency in the captain's voice. It wasn't just impatience, it was a weight, a heaviness. Despite the unusual nature of the request, Agung responded without hesitation. Batik 6231, clear for takeoff. That short exchange quietly shifted the course of history. Mafella pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft began to roll, gathering speed until it lifted free of the ground. Inside the cabin, 148 passengers relaxed into their seats, unaware that they had just escaped the reach of a catastrophe by mere seconds. Some opened books, others closed their eyes. But in the cockpit, the captain's heart was pounding. He felt a mix of fear and relief. The plane was airborne, but he knew something unseen had forced his hand. Looking back later, Mafella would describe this as the strangest moment of his career. He had no evidence, no warning lights, just a whisper that said, "Go." And what happened exactly 3 minutes after takeoff proved that his decision was not superstition at all. As soon as the landing gear retracted and the runway lights blurred into streaks, the captain allowed himself to breathe. But below them, on the ground, the world began to change with terrifying speed. At exactly 6:05 p.m., a violent earthquake struck Palu with a magnitude of 7.5. The ground convulsed as if it were alive. The runway they had just used began to crack and shift, snapping like broken glass and turning into a field of jagged concrete. The air traffic control tower, a 4-story structure overlooking the field, began to sway dangerously. For anyone still at the airport, safety had vanished. In the sky, the passengers remained in blissful ignorance. Through the windows, they saw the coastline glowing in the fading light, never realizing that the same coastline was now bending under the power of seismic waves. The captain tried to call the tower. Silence. He tried again. No answer. Mafella felt a chill in his chest. He understood that silence on the radio was not a technical glitch. It was chaos. The difference between life and death was measured in minutes. If the flight had waited for its scheduled slot, the violent shaking would have struck before the plane could leave the ground. The asphalt would have split beneath the landing gear. With full fuel tanks and passengers on board, the aircraft would have been trapped in a death trap. A simple act, taking off 3 minutes early, placed them beyond the reach of the earthquake at the exact moment it unleashed its full force. But the earthquake was only the beginning. From 1,500 feet, Captain Mafella looked down and saw the ocean behaving in a way that no training manual could describe. Great rings of water began to expand outward from the epicenter. At first, he thought he was watching strange patterns of light, but within seconds he realized they were waves. They were rising higher, turning into walls of water. The sea was no longer calm. It was building a monster that would soon swallow the city. The coastline of Palu curved like a funnel, directing the full force of the tsunami straight into the heart of the city. From his vantage point, Mafella watched as buildings collapse and dust clouds rose where neighborhoods once stood. Roads split apart like torn paper. He called the tower again and again. The empty radio carried more weight than any scream. While the passengers noticed only strange ripples on the water, the captain understood the scale of the destruction. The ocean had answered the shock. He held the controls steady, guiding the plane higher, as if altitude alone could distance them from the hell below. He knew the passengers were safe, but thousands of people down there, in a city of 300,000, were doomed. But the story of that night was not just being written in the sky. While the plane headed north, a drama of courage and sacrifice was unfolding on the ground. Inside the control tower, chaos ruled. The building shook as if caught in the grip of a giant hand. Ceiling tiles fell like rain, windows burst outward. The controllers, who just a minute ago were guiding flights, were now fleeing for their lives. Fear replaced order. Colleagues of 21-year-old Anthonius Gunawan Agung shouted at him, "Leave now, the building is collapsing." But Agung did not move. On his radar screen, Flight 6231 was still climbing. The aircraft had not yet cleared the airport zone. If anything went wrong during these critical early seconds, the crew would need instructions, and only Agung could provide them. Duty outweighed instinct. Around him, the concrete cracked under the strain. Dust choked his lungs, but he kept his eyes on the screen, repeating the flight parameters in his head. To an outsider, it looked like madness to stay inside a falling building. But for Agung, it was a choice. He had dreamed of this job since childhood, and he was not going to abandon his post in the darkest moment. Seconds stretched into eternity. The ground shook harder. Outside the window, he saw the runway splitting apart, vehicles tossed like toys. But he waited. Only when the aircraft's blip finally disappeared from the radar screen, signaling that the flight was safe, did Agung allow himself to turn away from the console. But it was too late. In that moment, the cost of his choice became clear. The stairwell had collapsed into rubble. The exit was blocked by debris. The tower continued to sway, threatening to topple completely. Agung was trapped on the fourth floor. In the silence that followed, he understood what he had done. He had guaranteed safety for 148 strangers he would never meet, but he had left himself with no path to safety. In desperation, as the building began to list, he made a final decision: to jump. 4 stories up. The chances were slim, but staying inside meant certain death. Colleagues found him at the base of the tower amongst the wreckage. He was alive, but barely. He had suffered severe internal injuries and broken bones. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, but the situation there was catastrophic. Hundreds of victims were flooding in. There was chaos, a shortage of doctors, and no equipment to treat trauma of his magnitude. Agung needed help that this hospital could not provide. Doctors planned an emergency helicopter evacuation to a larger facility in another city. All he had to do was hold on. But the helicopter never came. The roads were destroyed, communication lines were down, and the chaos of the tsunami made outside help impossible to organize. That night, just hours after his act of courage, Anthonius Gunawan Agung passed away. He was 21 years old. High in the sky, inside the pressurized capsule of the airliner, 148 people continued their journey in blissful ignorance. Children laughed, adults dozed off. For them, it was just a flight. When the plane landed in Makassar, The passengers turned on their phones. And then reality hit. News notifications, videos of destruction, frantic messages from relatives. Only then did they realize what had happened in Palu immediately after their departure. Captain Mafella was one of the first to learn the truth. The silence on the radio hadn't been a glitch. It was the sound of people fighting for their lives, and of one young man staying at his post until the very end. The realization washed over the captain. Their safe flight had been paid for by a life he couldn't save. The story of Anthonius Agung spread across the world. His funeral became a national event. Soldiers carried his coffin, draped in the red and white flag of Indonesia. Thousands lined the streets. In a country devastated by the elements, his action became a symbol of hope. He wasn't a general, he didn't hold a high office. But in a single critical moment, he made a choice that saved more lives than most people can imagine. Officially, he was declared a national hero. But for 148 passengers, he was a guardian angel. Palu's airport was eventually rebuilt. Within its new walls stands a memorial honoring Agung. His story is now taught in aviation schools as the ultimate example of responsibility. The story of Flight 6231 reminds us that true heroism is often quiet and unseen. It is not born in loud speeches, but in the split seconds when duty outweighs fear. The captain trusted an instinct. The controller trusted his duty. Together, they created a miracle in the midst of a disaster.